Coming up, the NBA draft came and went, and the Brooklyn Nets were unable to join the 2024 draft party. However, with Cam Johnson and Dorian Finney-Smith still on the roster, we break down the trades that did not happen for them and how there's a comfortable path forward to continuing to clear cap space off this roster for the future moves. We break it all down coming up next.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, my friends, it is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. He's Doug Norrie. I'm Adam Marmbrick. We thank you, as always, for making us your first listen of the day. We are 100% free on all those great platforms. And let you know, today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use promo code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms, they do apply, Doug. And some terms that apply to being a Brooklyn Nets fan right now is taking a relaxed approach to the next phases of this franchise, because there's no stress right now, even around still having veterans like Cam Johnson and Dorian Finney-Smith on this roster.
Yeah, a little surprised to see Cam and DFS still on the team. Talked about this yesterday, going into the second round. Thought there was like maybe some chance they get something worked out around a second round pick and maybe a future first or something like that with one of these guys. I believe they were active. There was actually one point where the Kings made a trade, sending Davion Mitchell and Vezenkov over to the Raptors for Jalen McDaniels. And I was like, oh, well, that kind of made me think at the time, well, the Nets are probably out of it now, right? Because that was some of the matching money that, like, especially for DFS, that would have come back and being able to make something that worth it. Although then there was like the second part where I was like, well, they're freeing up a roster spot and maybe because they took on less money in that deal and they were clearing away some money. That was like, oh, maybe we see like a Barnes plus Herter plus picks for both guys. Like I was kind of like holding out this like little bit of hope that something like that happened. Maybe it still ends up happening like that. They were clearly making that move as a pre-move to something else. Long story short, Cam Johnson and DFS still on the team. Not the end of the world. Clearly not part of the future plans. So we'll see how this sort of shakes out over the long term. My guess is their days are numbered and we'll just kind of see where it ends up landing. But, it's definitely a different tenor now around this, where I feel like we would have been much more annoyed had they cleared away this draft with like at least DFS still on the team. It doesn't seem to have the same overall sort of gestalt around around the emotions based on sort of like where they're headed now.
No, and nor should it, right? You make the big decision. You commit to rebuilding this roster. You move Mikal Bridges for an absolute haul, as we've outlined multiple times already, but we'll continue to talk about it over the course of this offseason. So once that's done, I think it takes it should take a lot of the stress off of the Nets fan base saying, hey, yes, we want to make these moves with these players at some point. And I think the one thing that some fans have brought up is saying, well, you can't go into the season with these guys on the roster. You can't risk winning games that you really want to lose when you're trying to be your own tank commander and get the number one pick. And that's true. I without making it as simple as they were really bad last year, and that was with Mikal Bridges, I don't think we need to be too risk concerned around Cam Johnson and Dorian Finney-Smith upsetting that apple cart. The other thing, too, is even with players like these, you're not talking about going into a season without having your eyes wide open. So guess what? Maybe Cameron Johnson doesn't play as much at the start of the year because you're waiting to figure out these trades. Maybe Dorian Finney-Smith doesn't, and there isn't going to be some internal struggle for the Nets of want to be competitive, said we wanted to make the playoffs. So they very much can control how you get yourself from this point right now, having moved Mikal, still having a few veterans, to the place where, okay, we're ready to move them, and we're still able to make sure that we get ourselves into a good spot when it comes to next year's draft class.
The one risk with this is, I will say there is one risk, and we've seen this happen with the Nets before, is that these guys get injured, right? And then all of a sudden, like, there's no trade value at all. Because, like, you can play and increase your trade value, right? Play well. Like Cameron Johnson could probably come out and stand to, play well at the beginning of the season, and all of a sudden he's looking very much like an incredible value for a contending team, right? 3-and-D wing, we know he can still shoot, like stuff like that. Really, that travels, right? Like his skill set travels for sure. DFS too. The problem is both these guys were injured last year. They're not exactly spring chickens, and if they were to get injured, then that would tank the value. a la sort of what happened with Joe Harris, kind of what
Mhm.
happened with Seth Curry. Like we've seen this happen before where guys look like they would have had some market, but ill-timed injuries, or you just like waited just a little too long and they never really recovered, because that's just what happens as guys kind of get age out. So that's like the one little, and it's actually not even little, that is the one risk more for DFS than Cam, just because the contract is kind of goes out for a few years here. So I think that like there's, I honestly, Cam Johnson could play it the whole year here. And I still think there's like a world where he's on the trade block the next year or something.
Mhm.
I don't think it's like, I don't think they have to move him right away. I know maybe some fans will disagree with that,
No,
but,
yeah, go ahead.
and also too, I will say when you're headed for the tank, having some professional veterans around that can kind of be like, hey, this is how an NBA player works, and this is how our mindset should be, and stuff like that. Like, that's not the worst thing either.
Yeah.
So DFS, and I think they're like slightly in different categories for me. But DFS, he's got to go by the trade deadline for sure. If Johnson was still on the team, is it the worst thing in the world? There'll still be trade value. His contract decreases the year after, so it's like there's gonna be someone coming for that if he's even moderately healthy.
And that was one of the things too. The contracts matter here as well. Obviously, player option for the final year for Dorian Finney-Smith would probably opt out of it, but then just getting any level of value at all obviously changes it. Cam Johnson, you mentioned the contract. Somebody brought this up about now with a contract like that, and it was a reminder. Hey, the contract looked bad. Again, we always talk about this relative to expectation and performance. It's not a bad contract by cap perspective. It's a
No,
low
no.
$20 million a year contract for a 3 and D-ish type of wing who, yes, has some injury concerns, but will represent tremendous value for contending teams. And that's where I come back there to the top about some teams are going to have to just make some moves around their money and their rosters. So giving some flexibility there to get to the place where they can take in Cam Johnson's contract may just be about patience if you're the Brooklyn Nets. And ironically, we sit here now, 7 days later from building up to the draft, talking about Sean Marks, what he needs to or does not need to do. And now I sit here and go, and I have no concerns about Sean Marks getting the best value out of Cam Johnson in his contract now. Whereas just before, you'd say, I don't know. We have no clue what this guy's up to. Maybe he doesn't understand that he's going the wrong way. Now feels like the franchise has ironically righted itself, even though it's going in a very specific losing direction. Coming up here in a second, is there a trade that you wish the Nets had made going into or coming out of this draft class? And do we think that there were moves that we could have seen them doing based on what other teams did, especially even going into those second rounds? We'll get into all that coming up here in just one moment.
All right, before that, tell you about our friends over at Gametime. Look, it's the summertime. It's all about going to some MLB games. You got the hot weather. You can sit out there in the sun. Yeah, you can watch the Mets or the Yankees or whatever city you happen to be in. You got to head over to Gametime to make sure you get your share of the fun this summer. Best deals on last-minute tickets. They got Houston at Mets over there at Citi Field, starting at $23 over at Gametime. Reds at Yankees next week, starting Wednesday, starting at $20 on Gametime. You're not going to get better deals than this. This is what Gametime is all about. They got all kinds of last-minute tickets. They got flash deals. They got zone deals. You'll be able to see exactly what you see from your seat when you sit down, so there's no guesswork when it comes to just sitting down at a baseball game. Also, by the way, it's not just baseball, concerts, theater, comedy. It's all there for you over on Gametime, and it's so easy to get in the action. You download the Gametime app, you create an account, use the code LOCKEDONNBA. You're going to grab $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices guaranteed.
All right, so as we continue today's Locked On Nets episode, looking at what did not happen in the draft for Brooklyn and why it doesn't need to be a concern. Remember, while we said it's always worth it to have a pick in the 2024 draft, that was based around the idea of still having Mikal Bridges and saying adding a piece is always a good idea here. Once you get past that and you go into this tank version, I also think it changes how Sean Marks looks at it. Trades happen. People swap some picks and some players. But the idea of needing to get into this draft felt starkly different. I think if the right deal is there, it's fine. If not, you can wait yourself into free agency and for what other moves are going to happen, maybe going towards the deadline. Do you feel like, is there a world where the reason why it didn't happen here is because Sean Marks is looking at it, and I'd say rightfully, and saying, we're not going to devalue these two players right now just to get them off the books and grab the 27th pick from the Minnesota Timberwolves. It's okay. We'll wait until you're out of this draft. And then if we talk about a first round value, talk to me about 25, 26, 27, 28. I'll take the risk of upside draft classes over what was perceived to be a weak one right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was always going to be hard. Talked about this yesterday, and we talked about this before. I actually think it was always going to be hard with these two guys around just draft picks, right? Because it's too much salary. If you look at the trades that were made, very few players were traded here during this draft, right? Denny Avdia was traded. I think we can agree Avdia had like considerably more value than either of these two guys based on age and contract. His contract's awesome.
Yep.
And like just sort of like, so he was always going to have much more value. And then that was really it after that Kings trade, which basically swapped around spare parts in like the 8 million or less range. These guys make, 15 and 20 plus $million, meaning that what was going to have to come back was always going to be a player and a pick or something like that. And was always going to be tough. We just said this so many times. Go fire up that trade machine and start putting together realistic deals with these guys' money that other teams would be into right now. And it's just not super easy. It's doable, but it's not incredibly clean because, usually it's with DFS, it takes like aggregating a few like smaller salaries together. And then you're throwing out two players in a pick. And now it kind of starts feeling weird. And then Cam just makes a lot of money. So now you got to get like a mid-range kind of like, MLE kind of guy in there at minimum, usually more. And then some of these teams can't even aggregate salaries because like the second April, like there's a lot of different stuff here that was always going to be a little tricky. By the way, that might not get easier. With the way the cap is now and the way some of these other contracts are valued, it might not get super easy. So I just think that I was never shocked and surprised. I think neither of us were. We're never shocked and surprised that this didn't happen because we had done this work ourselves to try to put these trades together ahead of time.
It came up
for
a few
multiple episodes
between.
Dude, we did a few times on this. We're like, it's tough. Go through all the teams that might be interested in here and go put together the trades. It doesn't get very easy based on the two criteria. You got to match the money and you got to send out picks.
Yeah.
And these picks are highly valuable in this new cap situation.
And that's where I think is, especially when it comes to, you mentioned about looking at it from a realistic perspective. And I wonder if Sean Marks, not to a limiting necessarily degree, but looked at it as well and said, well, yeah, I can look at contracts potentially that would match this here. Send out Dorian Finney-Smith, take a guy back that has multiple years left on his deal. Likewise for Cam Johnson. I think it doesn't have to be stringent because I think 2 years remaining on a deal is fine depending on what the money is. But by and large, I only want to take back money that expires right now, right? I want the money that comes off the books after this upcoming season. You already have Dennis Schroeder on the books, who some people brought up, and it's easier to look at him and say, he's a veteran. Does he fit the timeline? Of course not, but the money expires. So you can put that into the Ben Simmons category. Now you got $53 million coming off the books. If you get two more contracts coming back in for Cameron Johnson and Dorian Finney-Smith that both expire, it's going to be then pushing it towards $70 and $80 million that you have coming off the books, right? So I think that matters here too. If you're Sean Marks, and while we look at it and say at a minimum, got to get to next year's draft class, got to get player X in the door. Okay, fine. Top prospect, 26, rinse and repeat. And you have multiple picks in next year's draft, but having all that money then gives you the flexibility to say, how do we feel about our young core? Are we ready to maybe throw some assets in on key free agent X, Y, or Z? So keeping yourself as clean as possible through these transactions is as important. Now having all the stockpile of draft assets and your own control for the next 2 years, I think keeping clean is the most important thing you can accomplish here relative to getting future draft picks for one of these two players.
Yeah, and again, this is where it's like sometimes hard to find the motivations for their teams. I did think there was like a world where if the Kings saw DFS and Cam Johnson as upgrades on, let's say, Herder and Barnes, whose contracts go out a little longer, and it's like, hey, DFS is expiring, and Cam Johnson just fits a little better, like he can just play some of these minutes that like some of these guys can't, then it's okay to take on a few more years of salary for where the Nets are.
Yeah,
it's like, it's like, oh,
Matt George and I did this in real time while the draft was unfolding, trying to strike the deal between the Kings and the Nets. And it was, Herder, okay, put him in the mix. It's going to be Barnes, okay, put him in the mix for both these players, but it gets a couple of picks thrown in there and you say, okay, you can see the value being created there.
Yeah, because like Barnes at $19 million in 2025, who cares, right? Like Herder at $18 million, in 25, 26, who cares? It doesn't matter. The Nets are going to need to spend in those years anyway. They're going to need,
Right.
this is where we're going to see probably them take on some maybe distressed assets from other teams, because they're going to soak in, they're going to have once Simmons clears, they're going to have a massive amount of cap space.
Yeah.
Even with like a Thomas extension and the Claxton contract, they're going to have like nothing on the books if Cam Johnson and goes out and DFS goes out. So taking on, $36 million of kind of just like aging whatever dudes with a pick or two attached is just fine, right? With where they are. It would have been bad in a previous iteration where it'd be like, oh my gosh, what are they doing? But now they're going to have to take on guys whose money just doesn't really match with other teams and whose skill set don't really match. So I thought like that was like the one where I was like, oh, maybe these two guys come back, and if they just have to eat it for 25, 26, I mean, legit, who cares? And by the way, one other thing, and I'm sure we'll do a podcast about this. I've seen this come across my feed a few times. It's like, the Nets need this. Hey, newsflash, the Nets don't need anything. Like,
Right.
oh, they need a point guard. No, they do not.
No.
They need this. No, they do not.
No.
They don't need anything. They need to lose games. Sorry. That's where we are. We're not getting drafting for fit, and we're not, making trades for fits. It doesn't matter. Nothing needs to fit. Frankly, the worse it fits, the better.
Right. It's the rare case where we used to say, my God, all these miscast characters that don't fit together. Great. I'd love to have nothing but players that don't look like they could function together on the court together for the season. Obviously, tongue in cheek with a lot of these young guys that we want to see develop. One other thing here. You mentioned two things here. It started to specifically around that Kings pick. That's Devin Carter. Then you get Bub Carrington goes to Portland at 14. Teams making these moves. Obviously, even some guys that we had talked about and liked, like Khalil Ware coming out of that first round. Your guy, Deron Sharp, in the 22nd spot with Phoenix. But I think about how when you see those happen, it goes back to that positional value you talk about. Some people saying, oh, well, you should be getting these players. There's point guards. They can develop. I said, well, just calm down here. You're not missing out on this developmental season for player X, Y, or Z. There's things that maybe they could do. And if they had gotten in there and taken one of those players, I'd be interested to see how that works going forward.
Yeah, like if they take a Collier or something like that, like it's like, okay,
Yeah.
Reclamation project. The guy, we guys talked about this yesterday, but like he falls all the way down the draft. He's number 2 overall high school guy, falls all the way. It's like kind of a Derek Whitehead situation. It's like,
right,
massive upside, crazy down year. Gigi Jackson, same thing.
Yep.
Like where it's like number one, these guys who just kind of tank their value after 1 year at the college level. And like, so anyway, sorry. And you said Day'Ron Sharp, but I think you meant Day'Ron Holmes. Got the wrong Day'Ron on the brain.
Holmes, because the other note I wanted to just put in here was also on Day'Ron in a second, talking about, is there something you would have liked to do around players that are up for contract extensions and maybe don't have a big time future, but represent a weird middle ground of being young, having some skill set, but maybe not being part of the long-term future for the Brooklyn Nets? We'll dive into that and tie a bow on the 2024 draft coming up here in just one moment.
All right, before we get to that, tell you about our friends over at eBay Motors. Passion, drive, patience. It's a formula for winning championship. It's also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle. You're going to level up to peak performance. They got superchargers. They got roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, so much more. Maybe it's speed, maybe it's power, maybe it's style. eBay Motors has you covered. There's 122 million parts for your number one ride or die. You'll find exactly what you're looking for. With eBay Guaranteed Fit, your parts guaranteed to fit your ride every time, or your money back. With eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP. Bring home those huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit. Only available to U.S. customers.
So as we wrap up today's Locked On Nets episode, reminder, get over to YouTube, get over to X, follow at Doug Norrie, at Adam Armbrecht, at Locked On Nets. Over on YouTube, did the live around the Mikal Bridges trade, saw an absolute surge. Not only everyone was there live with us at the time, but also our subscribers, which we really appreciate because you know us. We're always pushing for that next mountain to climb. 8,000. That's the number we're looking for.
Come on, baby.
See, Doug's excited about it, and you know this guy does not ramp it up for nothing. The one thing coming out of this draft that I thought was interesting, too, I mentioned Day'Ron Sharp there. The idea of, as you get towards the back end of the first round specifically, there are players, and by the way, at a high level, whether it was internal network mocks, whether it's just going and looking at 4 or 5 different outlets and seeing where some of these guys ranked, you also got a very clear sense that, which is often the case back in the first round going to the second round, well, a team like this prospect. But we're talking about that all the way up into the mid-teens of this draft, where it felt like you were getting names pulled here, going to rosters where the clear thought was, oh, this team really liked this guy. You usually don't see that type of player identification rather than BPA, best player available strategy, usually pays dividends through most of the draft. This came in where you had guys getting taken in the teens that had ranges all the way back to the second round. You had guys getting taken at the back end of the second round that maybe were in the 40s or 50s. And I thought that really drove home the idea of what this draft class was. It's a lot of possibility, real speculative options here. And some of it really came down to who can we draft that another team kind of likes, and maybe we kind of facilitate something here for ourselves. This felt very non-player related in a lot of instances when it came to where guys went in this draft class.
I mean, that part we could kind of see coming because as we heard and saw ourselves, like in just doing a bunch of draft analysis when we thought the Nets might trade in, is that like this draft was not full of high-end talent, but was full of guys who could do usually like one thing well and other things not so well, right? Like can score but can't play defense, right? Like has really great size and length, but like the touch isn't there, right? Or just, has, good size but can't get to the outside, can shoot the outside but can't rim protect. Like, or, there's all this different stuff, defense only. So then, right, so when you have like 1.5 NBA skills and outside of the 4, then at that point, it's easy for teams to draft forfeit because they're like, hey, we actually just need this, right? Like we need a wing defense right here. We need shooting. We need size. Like, and then the best player available will be the guy that fits because everyone's got flaws.
Yeah. So
I'm not really surprised that the draft really played out like this. And actually, I think it's why, especially around the middle of the draft, teams can get pretty excited for who they drafted, because they know these guys, a lot of these guys can step in right away and probably play. Like that's why you saw like Lakers fans going nuts about Dalton Connect. It's like, all right, he drops. They need shooting, right? And secondary scoring. Well, he can do that, right? Yep. Like, and so, maybe some head scratchers with Edey moving all the way up, but you're like, well, they need size. And like, that's just maybe going to help them in the short term. So I'm not sure, like thematically, I'm not really surprised at how it played out. It's also why a team like the Nets, who don't need anything, don't need to be incentivized to get into a draft like this. It's like, well, I mean, unless you're drafting for just pure unadulterated upside.
Oh yeah.
You
better. Sorry, I apologize. You talk about unadulterated upside, and that gets me going, buddy.
That is gonna ring out. So anyway, I just like I'm not surprised, and so. Yeah, I don't know. That's it.
I got to be honest with you. I think I derailed what was a very coherent point that Doug was making there. The bottom line, I do agree with you, right? And there is the one thing when you say unadulterated upside, Ulrich Komche, who I'll say the name wrong there, he goes at the back end of the second round. He's an 18-year-old, 7'4". The guy is a wingspan monster. He's young. He's raw and developed, and that's the kind of guy. And this is all that I really did when I started getting into the active live draft was looking at the talent, looking at the skill set, and then going, tell me that age. If you're sub 19 years old, we can have a conversation where the Brooklyn Nets look at you and tell themselves, not even a story. They just say, great, take 2 years, see what happens. And if it's nothing, not a big deal. And if it's something, wow, that could be really great for us going forward. There's 2 other things I just wanted to touch on here quickly. One is when you do get into the second round and a guy like Kyle Filipowski, who was all the way up near 20 and then also back into the mid 30s in this draft, this represents, thinking about Day'Ron Sharpe, some version of if the Brooklyn Nets wanted to try, quote unquote, try something different at the center position. This is where if you could make a trade in the second round, I found it interesting to look at a guy who's not ultra athletic, not going to blow you away with some of the measurables, but can shoot the ball. Pretty good facilitator for a big man, right? Can rebound a little bit. There was a version of it where I liked the idea of just swapping out something different to see, because one thing Brooklyn has done through every iteration of this roster has basically looked at the center or 5 position and said, I don't know, offense, that's kind of here or there, but we do like a good defensive rebounding player. Like that, I philosophically would have minded. And I don't mean this as a critique or because they didn't. I'm disgusted with Sean Marks.
Yeah, there's also like some weirdness around why he might have dropped. Like there was like speculation around, like, I hate to even say this because it sounds like so tabloidy, but it's actually been reported. So I don't feel too crazy about this draft. I think Gavoni might have reported this, but like that he just like there's like weird stuff with his girlfriend and his family, and actually like that was the part that like really dropped him. I guess we don't need to go all the way into this, but like he's got a girlfriend that's a lot older than him, and he's estranged from his family. And there's like other parts of this I don't even want to get into, but I don't know. I can see like I can see Marks and company being like, You know what? Don't even want to answer the questions.
Well, by the way,
and I think
right,
this might be a reason he
ask
went to
questions
Utah.
because I don't want
There's a
the
reason
answer.
I think like the Utah guys didn't see as many problems as some other teams. If you just like look into some of the background of that story.
Yeah, and by the way, in name only or in skill set only. But
I know what you're saying.
Yeah,
yes.
yeah. Even the idea of just like, hey, even somebody who has something going on, you're like, great. If it doesn't work out for any number of reasons on or off the court, again, it's not going to be something that really does us long-term damage. So there's players like that certainly spark the interest, at least when you work your way into that second round. And I'll just quickly throw out too, a guy like Tyler Kolek, who's also at a Marquette, like the walking antithesis of what you expect an NBA player to look like, and all of the measurables. This guy's a disaster. But I think this is just the overall theme too. Look where these players go. Contribute now versus develop later, right? And the Brooklyn Nets are in a spot where they don't have to worry about any of these things. But seeing the fit of some of these guys, and we do this every year in the draft, you can tell yourself a better version of a player's young career early on based on where they go and based on what that team has and what they want to accomplish. Like you said about shooting. Hey, we need some shooting. Great. That means you'll get on the court immediately. Doesn't mean that you're the perfect player, but if you have the right fit, then you can maximize skill sets, especially in a weak draft class. So again, something that need not apply to Brooklyn. We don't need anything right now. It doesn't matter if we have shooting. It doesn't matter, as some fans have been bringing up. Well, do we run the risk of Cam Thomas accidentally winning too many games because he'll be taking all the shots? If that's where we're at, guys, don't worry about it. Cam Thomas is capable of scoring 40 and 50 points a night, and this isn't about him. It didn't help the team win or lose anything. Like that's the ultimate thing here coming out of this draft is let go of all of your concerns around what's going to happen over the short term. It feels like it's a pretty clear path, and Sean Marks and the Nets are going to get to the ultimate destination. Their odds are going to be 14% to land the first overall pick in the 2025 lottery. I have little to no concern that they understand that's the objective, and they'll do everything it takes to get there.
Yeah, it sure seems like. A couple of quick housekeeping things here. The Nets did sign two guys as soon as the draft ended. They signed KJ Jones from Emmanuel College, a D2 school, to an Exhibit 10 deal. It's hilarious because his numbers are like, you're like, look at his numbers, like eye popping. It's like, okay, it was a D2. We just got to remember. We got to remember that. So, anyway, he's on Exhibit 10, and they did sign Mark Armstrong from Villanova, which made the rounds as an ultimate troll job. So it's like, hey, let's just grab all the Villanova guys and then see if the Knicks still want to do business because, Wildcat Nation over there that's happening over in New York. But Armstrong, interesting guy from the guard position. We'll see where these guys end up landing. I'm sure we'll see him in Summer League.
Also, coming back in next week, we'll talk about what the final deal looks like with the Brooklyn Nets and the New York Knicks because it involves
that one's not. By the way, that's not solidified yet. There's a rumor that I don't think they're going to end up having to do it, but that Deuce McBride might have had to be added to make the money work. My guess is that's not going to happen, but. Oh, baby.
Yeah, because they've made some other decisions, and Hartenstein and OG, they made that deal, but they maybe make other choices to be able to avoid it. But yeah, that perked up here over the last 24, 36 hours. You're like, oh, hold on a second. Give me one more player on this. So, but even with the 2031 draft picks being involved, it couldn't be finalized until you get to the point when you can include a draft pick that is that many years out. So it isn't officially on the books. Maybe some things will look a little bit different, and we'll break that down next week too.
Yeah, so a lot to talk about here. Obviously, we're going to talk. Look, off season is going to be chock full of different. We're going to do some Cam Thomas stuff. I think it's going to be interesting to think about like what his future really looks like here. We'll talk about the guys like Daron Sharp who maybe just are on the team. Ben Simmons, obviously. There's a lot of things that sort of are question marks going forward as we kind of go into a year that we just kind of have to. And I think we're just going to do a couple State of the Union about what to really expect. I know there's been excitement over sort of picking a direction, a reminder that this direction is going to include losing a lot of basketball games. And I think that that's maybe something that hasn't really kind of crystallized in terms of some fans sort of thought processes yet. But regardless, we'll get into that. Okay. Make sure, like Adam said, make sure you subscribe over on YouTube. Just a huge jump on YouTube. People, if the YouTube numbers are any are there any indication people absolutely love the direction the Nets took? Because
That's
the
right.
YouTube has been absolutely popping off. Make sure you subscribe to Locked
And
On
love
Nets
the
over on
direction
YouTube.
that we've been taking, Doug. I
Oh, of
think
course.
that's really a part of it too. When you come in, you see two guys doing their thing and honestly operating at a very high level. It's impressive. And from that standpoint, got to remind you that I have no desire to prove anything by dancing. I have never used it as an outlet or means of expressing myself. I just dance. I just put my feet in the air and move them around. And that is Frederick Astaire.
Oh, one of the all-time great posts. We're back again
Right.
next week talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.
Basketball, 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 basketball. Yeah.